Lisa Timpf, The ABCs of Sci-Fi Nightmares.
AI masters with human slaves, bug-eyed monsters roaming towns, cataclysmic earthquakes reshaking the earth, doomsday clock tick-tocking down, Earth's slim mantle fracking fractured, flesh-eating bacteria running amok, genetically modified crop collapse, hackers grinding the banks to a stop, invertebrate pests from outer space, jellyfish flying on fleshy wings, killer asteroids targeting Earth, lunar miners unearthing strange things. Mass extinctions are we next. New world disorder everywhere. Oceans expanding, coasts submerged. Plague ship landing in Delaware. Cubic computers plotting our death. Runaway greenhouse gas effect. Self-driving cars with minds of their own. Toxins oozing from ocean wrecks. Uranium containment springing leaks. Volcanoes spewing fire and ash. Werewolves prowling city streets. XT armies launching attacks. Youngsters on Mars mutating fast. Zombies blank-eyed lurching past.
So I've written poetry for a long time, since I was a child, although I didn't really produce anything publishable till I was in my 20s. I like poetry as a form of self-expression and as a way of exploring feelings. And sometimes I've used poetry as a way to kind of process my response to news events or current events. So this poem explores a mixture of plausible and not so plausible nightmare scenarios, if you will, for our planet. Some of them are drawn from actual existing threats. For example, the doomsday clock is a real thing. We've had close encounters with asteroids before. Hackers and flesh-eating bacteria do exist. But then mixed in with that are more fanciful things like bug-eyed monsters and alien creatures. Deep down, it's about the things we fear, as well as the bad things that might happen if we don't pay attention to what we're doing with the planet. Generally, my poems arise from one of three sources: a response to a news item or current event, a thought that's occurred to me that I'm trying to express or grapple with, or a poetry or writing exercise. And in this particular case, the poem was inspired by a poetry exercise where you try to go through the alphabet listing items that start with each letter in turn. And so when I first started writing this poem, I really had no idea where it was going to go. But just for fun, I started listing all the science fiction nightmare things I could imagine alphabetically and found that I got on a roll. And then as I was taking the initial draft and working with it, I discovered there was a natural rhythm emerging. And so it also so happened some of the lines I'd written formed a rough rhyme scheme. So I decided to work with that and shape the poem to incorporate 4 beats per line, with every second line rhyming and a rhyming couplet at the end. Well, some of the things I think about writing poetry, I would say that poetry is a great way for exploring personal feelings, but if you're writing with a view of wanting other people to read it, you need to look for something more universal and build your poem in a way for other people to connect with it. So that's why I like to write speculative poetry or kind of science fiction poetry. I find that it takes me out of myself and provides a good scope for portraying something others can look at and identify with or understand. I would say critical to being able to write poetry is to read poetry, particularly poetry you enjoy. And finally, I would say be willing to experiment. You don't always have to know what you're going to come out with at the end. You don't have to sit down and say, well, I'm going to write a poem about X. You can use exercises. You can kind of explore your subconscious and see what kind of themes emerge and then use that as a raw material for your poetry. One thing is poems that I really like, I don't necessarily just read once. I tend to reread them. And I also like to reread poetry that I've enjoyed in the past because I find I get more out of it when I go back and revisit it. For example, I have a literature textbook for second year university that I still dip into now and then, read T.S. Eliot or Thomas Hardy and so on. When I read a poem, I'm looking for a number of things. So, I enjoy humor, so something that makes me laugh is great. When I was a child, I enjoyed Ogden Nash, and I think that part of that has lasted into adulthood. And then when I'm reading a poem, I look for, does it make me think, or does it make me feel, or is there something I can connect with? When I was reading Mary Soon Lee's poetry book, The Sign of the Dragon, there were little things that kind of made me nod my head. The way she demonstrated an understanding of cat behavior, or what makes a good leader, for example. I like poems that surprise me with a twist at the end, so I kind of look for that. And I also enjoy good imagery and metaphor. So when I'm reading a poem, these are some of the things that kind of increase the enjoyment level for me. And I try to appreciate what the author is trying to do or say or achieve with that particular poem. So, for example, Sarah Toomey wrote a poem about Ursula Le Guin after Ursula Le Guin had passed away. And what I enjoyed about this poem, of course, there was imagery, and it tied in so many things that if you had read some of Ursula Le Guin's poetry or her writing, her books, like the Earthsea books, for example, you would glean little things out of the poem, and so you could really appreciate what the author was trying to say with that. What I enjoyed about Mary Soon Lee's book, The Sign of the Dragon, is there was a lot of free verse, and it was quite simple, but it was also very efficient, and it sketched out the image of what was going on with very few brushstrokes. It's sort of like if a painter drew a painting, but it wasn't all filled in. It was a few subtle clues that you could then put together to create the image for yourself. So a place you would maybe definitely want to visit, I would say Algonquin Park, if you like nature. It's a huge park in Ontario. Or if you're more into scenery, you might want to go to Niagara Falls, which is quite famous. And a food you might want to try, maple syrup, authentic, that's made here in Canada, grown, from the maple trees that are right on some farmer's property and then simmered down and made sort of the traditional way. I would say I'd give a shout out, maybe not to a specific person, but to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. It's been very helpful in sort of having a set of colleagues to rely on. They promote the work of their members. They encourage the writing of speculative poetry, and I'm really glad that I became a member of that particular group.
And thank